October 6th, 1943. The waters of Blackett Strait were blacker than ink. Even the moon hid behind the clouds, as if unwilling to witness what was about to happen. At 22:30 hours, the Japanese destroyer Yugure surged through the channel at 30 knots, 400 feet of steel, its guns manned, engines thrumming, officers confident. They had done this dozens of times before. The Tokyo Express ran by routine, deliver men and supplies, vanish before dawn. But this night, there was something new in the dark. 800 yards off the starboard bow, a flicker of phosphorescent wake betrayed a small, fast-moving shadow. Barely 80 feet long, painted black, almost invisible. Its crew of 15 held their breath as 3 Packard engines screamed beneath their feet, 4,050 horsepower of Detroit Fury, propelling a wooden shell faster than any destroyer afloat. The Japanese lookouts didn't even spot the wake until the first torpedo was already cutting the water. In the next 90 seconds, everything the Imperial Navy believed about naval warfare, range, firepower, size, would be ripped apart by speed, surprise, and American ingenuity. These were PT boats, patrol torpedo craft, dismissed by enemy officers as floating toys, nuisance weapons that barked but rarely bit. But on this night, that arrogance would vanish with the flash of a single explosion. Because what tore through the Pacific that year wasn't just a boat, it was a revolution in naval combat. And it started not in shipyards or admirals' offices, but in the roaring hearts of young men who believed that speed could conquer steel. So how did America's smallest boats become Japan's greatest fear? Let's go back to the beginning, to the myth that made the Imperial Navy blind. For 2 years, Japanese destroyers ruled the night. In the early Pacific campaigns of 1942, the Imperial Navy moved through darkness like a predator. Their sleek, 2,000-ton destroyers delivered troops and ammunition to isolated garrisons, high-speed convoys. The Americans came to fear and name the Tokyo Express. They were fast, they were disciplined, and above all, they believed themselves untouchable. Each destroyer carried long, narrow torpedoes that no other navy could match, the legendary Type 93 Long Lance. Its range was astonishing, its warhead devastating. When those torpedoes struck, entire American cruisers vanished in bursts of flame. From Savo Island to Tassafaronga, the night belonged to Japan. American sailors whispered that the Japanese could see in the dark. And in a sense, they could. Years of night-fighting training gave their gunners and lookouts an edge that U.S. crews simply didn't have. So when American commanders began deploying small patrol boats, 80-foot, wooden, unarmored craft, the Japanese laughed. These so-called mosquito boats posed no threat to destroyers 10 times their size, but confidence is a dangerous weapon. The Imperial Navy's destroyer captains grew accustomed to the idea that smaller enemies were beneath them. They saw every engagement as a formality, every attack as predictable, every encounter as victory assured. And on the other side of the ocean, in forgotten workshops and hidden bays, a handful of young Americans were preparing to turn that arrogance into the deadliest trap of the war. They weren't building battleships. They were building something faster, something the enemy would never expect. What made these small boats faster than anything else on the ocean wasn't naval genius, it was Detroit. The Navy had dreamed of a fast torpedo boat since the 1930s, but it took the industrial power of American car makers to make it real. At the Packard Motor Car Company, engineers used the same mechanical bloodline that powered Spitfires and Mustangs, a marine version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Each unit produced roughly 1,350 horsepower. Mount 3 of them side by side, and suddenly an 80-foot wooden hull could leap across the sea at over 40 knots. That kind of speed changed everything. A destroyer's guns could track planes, but not boats that darted and zigzagged like hornets. The roar of the engines was deafening, 3 12-cylinder beasts howling in perfect harmony. Sailors nicknamed them the Devil's Falcons. Japanese lookout crews would later recall hearing that unique sound in their nightmares, but speed alone wasn't enough. The hulls, built from layers of mahogany plywood, were both light and expendable. The Navy could produce dozens of PT boats in the time it took Japan to build one steel destroyer. They were meant to sting, vanish, and be replaced, a weapon of speed and numbers, not endurance. These machines were born from America's automobile heartland. Chrysler built the starters, Ford the fuel systems, and Packard the engines. Factories that once rolled out luxury cars now forged the teeth of the Pacific's fastest predators. It was a partnership that blurred the line between Detroit industry and naval warfare. Still, many officers doubted them. Wooden boats in the Pacific? They scoffed. A single shell will split them like kindling. And often, that was true. But the men who volunteered to command them weren't worried about surviving a hit. They were obsessed with landing one first. Each boat carried 4 torpedoes and 2 twin 50-caliber mounts. Later versions added cannons, mortars, even captured Japanese guns. They weren't built for beauty. They were built to charge. By mid-1942, the Navy had its first flotillas of PT boats ready for action. Young crews, mostly in their 20s, shipped out to the South Pacific with nothing but training manuals, wrenches, and nerves of steel. They didn't yet know how to fight, but the engines beneath their feet promised they could if someone taught them how. Speed meant nothing when your torpedoes missed. In the summer of 1942, America's new patrol torpedo boats entered combat for the first time in the waters off Guadalcanal. The men were eager, the engines flawless, the spirit high. But war, especially at night, had no patience for enthusiasm. The first missions were chaos. PT boats were assigned to intercept Japanese destroyers supplying troops to the island. But they operated with little radar, poor coordination, and unreliable Mark 8 torpedoes, weapons designed decades earlier and prone to running too deep or failing to detonate. Crews risked their lives closing to within 900 yards, only to watch their torpedoes trail harmlessly past the enemy. The Japanese captains barely took notice. When they did, they responded with terrifying precision searchlights flashing on, 5-inch shells crashing down, and tracer fire scything across the waves. The destroyers were faster than expected and could outrun or outgun anything the Americans sent. By November, the PT bases at Tulagi and Rendova were littered with damaged boats. Many were burned-out husks, hit by machine gun fire or destroyed by their own torpedoes. The men began calling their craft plywood coffins. Yet something remarkable happened. They didn't give up. PT boat crews were misfits mechanics, farm boys, and college dropouts who refused to back down. They tinkered with the engines, rewired radios, learned to read the sea by feel. They improvised shields out of scrap metal and welded extra guns to the decks. Every night they went back out, sometimes alone, often outnumbered. And while their early missions rarely sank destroyers, they accomplished something far more important. They forced the Japanese to change behavior. Convoys that once sped through the slot at 35 knots now slowed, zigzagged, and fired wildly into the dark, wasting ammunition and fuel. Each failed attack taught the Americans something new. They learned to coordinate by radio, to strike from multiple directions, to use the moon and shoreline as allies. By late 1942, one truth was clear. If they could fix the torpedoes and master their timing, the Tokyo Express would have to fear them. The lessons were brutal, but out of failure was born the doctrine that would soon terrify the Imperial Navy. What if 4 wooden boats attacked a destroyer like a pack of wolves? That was the question Lieutenant Commander John Bulkley asked one restless night in late 1942. He'd seen enough failures to know the old tactics didn't work. Single boats charging head-on into destroyer gunfire were suicide. But what if they struck together from different bearings, at full speed, confusing the enemy's gunners and radars long enough for at least one torpedo to hit home? Bulkeley called it the slash attack. It was simple, elegant, and utterly reckless. 3 or 4 PT boats would approach a Japanese column in darkness, engines throttled back to barely a whisper. At the commander's signal, all engines roared to life, propellers biting into the sea, each boat racing in from a different angle. The Japanese would swing their searchlights and open fire, but in those precious few seconds of panic, the PTs fired their torpedoes, turned hard away, and vanished into the black. The effect was devastating. The enemy could never tell how many boats were attacking. Radar, when it picked them up at all, showed a swarm of fast-moving blips that disappeared before they could be targeted. But Bulkeley's genius wasn't just in tactics, it was in training. He drilled his men relentlessly. Each crew practiced synchronizing engine bursts, torpedo angles, and withdrawal maneuvers until it became instinct. He demanded they trust one another completely, because in a real attack there was no time to second-guess. When they finally went into combat using the new system, everything changed. A squadron, operating near Kolombangara in mid-1943, used the slash attack to ambush a Japanese resupply convoy. 4 PT boats darted in at over 30 knots, weaving between the wakes of the larger ships. They fired 12 torpedoes from 3 sides of the formation, and within moments, one destroyer was burning from stem to stern. The Japanese gunners fought back fiercely, filling the night with tracers and explosions. But the boats were gone before their sights could adjust. All 4 returned to base intact. For the first time, the Imperial Navy realized these wooden raiders could kill. In the aftermath, U.S. commanders took notice. The Navy standardized Bulkeley's tactics across the Pacific. Radar coordination improved, radios were upgraded, and torpedo performance, thanks to the new Mark 13, finally became reliable. Now, the boats could not only attack, they could hunt. The Americans called it controlled chaos. The Japanese called it something else entirely, kamikiri, the slashers. And in the months that followed, the slashers would strike again, this time in one of the most audacious nighttime ambushes of the war. October 6, 1943. Blackett Strait, Solomon Islands, midnight. The sea was calm, too calm. A light mist hung low on the surface, muffling sound and bending light. Somewhere out there, the Japanese destroyer Yugure was running supplies to Kolombangara, 400 feet of steel, 30 knots of confidence, and a captain who believed no small boat could ever touch him. But tonight, 4 PT boats were waiting. Boats PT-60, PT-163, PT-167, and PT-170, commanded by men barely old enough to rent a car back home, crept silently through the darkness. Their engines idled low, their wakes invisible in the night. Each man on deck could hear his own heartbeat. They'd rehearsed this attack a dozen times on maps, now it was real. Radar picked up a faint echo, then another. Range, 800 yards. Arthur Regan gave the order, full throttle. 3 Packard engines howled in unison. The boats lunged forward, the sudden roar breaking the night open like a scream. On Yugure's bridge, alarm bells rang. Searchlights snapped on, slicing through the dark. The destroyer's guns began firing wildly, but there was nothing to hit. The PTs were attacking from 3 sides, their small silhouettes lost in the glare of their own wakes. At 700 yards, PT-167 fired its first pair of torpedoes. PT-60 followed seconds later. 4 white streaks raced across the surface, glowing faintly in the moonlight. For a brief moment, time froze. Then impact. A wall of fire erupted along Yugure's forward section. Metal shrieked, flames tore through the bridge, and sailors were hurled into the sea. Within minutes, the destroyer listed hard to port, her power lost, her deck burning like a floating torch. The remaining PTs kept circling, raking the wreck with machine gun fire to suppress survivors and secondary gunners. They didn't stay to watch her sink. The slash-attack doctrine demanded escape, not celebration. One by one, they vanished into the night, leaving behind nothing but wreckage and disbelief. When dawn came, Japanese recovery teams scoured the area. Survivors swore it had been torpedoes, but not from destroyers or submarines. The wakes were too short, too fast, too close. The enemy they'd once called nuisance boats had done the impossible. News of the sinking reached Tokyo within days. The report was brief but chilling. Enemy torpedo craft, small, numerous, fast. Impossible to defend against at close range. From that night on, no Japanese destroyer captain sailed the Solomon waters without fear. And the Americans? They'd proven something even they hadn't fully believed until then, that plywood could kill steel. After Blackett Strait, the fear spread faster than the flames that had consumed Yugure. The Imperial Navy had been humiliated. A 400-foot destroyer, one of its proudest instruments of night warfare, had been gutted by boats barely 1/5 its size. In Tokyo's war rooms, officers blamed radar failures and poor lookout discipline. But in the barracks and mess halls of the South Pacific, the truth took root in whispers. Crews began calling the American PTs Yurei no Sensha, the ghost tanks. They were ghosts because they struck from nowhere, fast, unseen, unpredictable. Japanese destroyer captains, who once cut confidently through the slot at full speed, now slowed their runs to 20 knots or less, afraid of what might be waiting in the dark. The once relentless Tokyo Express convoys began arriving late or not at all. Every splash in the night, every distant engine rumble, was now suspect. Lookouts fired at waves, at shadows, even at each other. The strain was unbearable. Reports from intercepted radio chatter told of Japanese officers refusing to enter narrow waters like Blackett Strait or Iron Bottom Sound after midnight. One destroyer commander, ordered to conduct a resupply mission, reportedly told his superiors, "I will go, but it will be my grave." It wasn't just fear, it was fatigue. The PT boats forced Japanese crews to operate at their limits. Every night they zigzagged, burned more fuel, and fired thousands of rounds into empty sea. The Navy that had once prided itself on efficiency now bled resources it couldn't replace. Meanwhile, the PT bases, once improvised camps of sandbags and jungle huts, had grown into lethal, coordinated outposts. With radar support from nearby cruisers and PBY Catalinas guiding them in, PT boats could now intercept enemy formations long before they reached their destinations. By mid-1944, the once mighty Tokyo Express had been reduced to a ghost of its former self. It wasn't sunk by battleships or bombers, but by a handful of wooden boats that never stopped coming. And for the first time in the war, Japanese destroyer captains began to admit something they'd never imagined, saying aloud they feared the Americans at night. Victory has a price. For the men of the PT squadrons, that price was everything they had, and often everything they were. Life aboard an 80-foot boat was a study in extremes. There was no armor, no air conditioning, no comfort, just heat, salt, and the deafening thunder of 3 Packard engines running day and night. The vibrations shook the very bones of the crew. Every plate and bolt rattled. They slept in sweat, ate in fumes, and lived inches above 3,000 gallons of high-octane fuel. They called it riding the dragon. One spark, one tracer round, and the entire boat could vanish in a single flash. Still, they volunteered. Most were barely out of college engineers, mechanics, farm boys, even a few athletes. They weren't sailors in the traditional sense. They were racers, improvisers, young men who thrived on danger. They joked that their motto should have been fast, wet, and loud. But behind the jokes was exhaustion and fear they rarely admitted. The enemy fire was constant. Tracer rounds tore across the decks, sometimes hitting fuel tanks, sometimes striking the men themselves. When a PT boat was hit, it burned instantly. The crew had seconds, not minutes, to escape. Many never did. Stories spread quickly through the squadrons. One boat, hit by a single shell, vanished so completely that all they found was a single engine block still spinning, still screaming. Another, caught in a searchlight, exploded before its torpedoes could even be fired, and yet they went out again. Every night, they learned to shut down engines and drift in silence, waiting for the right moment to strike. They navigated by starlight, the smell of burning fuel lingering in the air. Some claimed they could sense enemy ships before seeing them, a kind of sixth sense born from repetition and terror. Even heroes weren't spared the cost. Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, commanding PT 109, became the most famous survivor of the Pacific's Night War. His boat was sliced in half by a Japanese destroyer in August 1943. 2 of his men were killed instantly. The rest clung to debris for days until rescue. Kennedy's courage, swimming miles through dark water, towing a wounded crewman by his life vest strap, became legend. But it also revealed the truth of the PT war. Speed and daring could inspire glory, but it could not protect you. Those who survived rarely forgot. Many spoke of phantom engines echoing in their sleep. Years later, the constant hum of power and death intertwined. They carried the memories of friends lost in sudden bursts of fire, of nights that smelled like fuel and fear. But ask any of them if they'd trade it for a safer ship, and they'd smile. Because they knew what few others did, they made the giants bleed. War, in the end, is mathematics. The Japanese built their destroyers like precision instruments, fast, powerful, costly masterpieces of naval engineering. But the Americans built PT boats like Model T Fords, simple, quick, replaceable. And that difference changed the arithmetic of the Pacific. One Japanese destroyer took months of labor, thousands of tons of steel, and hundreds of skilled craftsmen. A single PT boat could be built in just a few weeks by a team of carpenters and machinists in Bayonne, New Jersey, or New Orleans. While Japan struggled to replace every loss, America's assembly lines produced 70 PT boats in the time it took to launch one destroyer. It wasn't just quantity, it was adaptability. PT boats didn't need dry docks or naval bases. They could be repaired with lumber, canvas, and a blowtorch. Damaged hulls were patched overnight, engines swapped in hours. They were the perfect weapon for an island-hopping war that demanded mobility and improvisation, and the tactics kept evolving. By 1944, the PT squadrons had become multi-role hunters. They didn't just ambush ships, they intercepted barges, shelled shore positions, rescued downed airmen, even guided landing craft through reefs and darkness. Their radar and radio coordination made them the Navy's eyes in waters where big ships couldn't go. Meanwhile, the Japanese Navy was collapsing under the weight of its own perfectionism. The Tokyo Express ran fewer missions each month. Destroyers that once delivered troops were now used for evacuation, running not toward battle, but away from it. The arrogance of 1942 had turned into desperation. When the U.S. Navy finally began its push north toward the Philippines, PT boats were already there, clearing channels, intercepting fleeing ships, harassing convoys. The Japanese called them the sharks of the shallows. Every engagement tilted the balance further. A destroyer might sink one PT boat, but there would be 5 more waiting by the next moonless night. Speed and numbers were now America's ultimate weapons. The very thing Japan once mocked, lightweight plywood, had become a symbol of industrial superiority. The Pacific had turned into a vast chessboard, and the Americans were playing with far more pieces. By 1945, the Imperial Navy was no longer the hunter, it was the prey. Today, the waters of Blackett Strait are quiet. Coral covers the twisted steel of what was once the destroyer WWII. The jungle has reclaimed the beaches where PT crews once fueled their engines and whispered final prayers before setting off into darkness. Only the sea remembers the roar of those Packard motors and the men who dared to believe that speed could conquer strength. When historians talk about the Pacific War, they often speak of aircraft carriers, battleships, and atomic power. But the real revolution came from something far humbler: 80 feet of wood, 3 engines, and 15 men with nothing but courage between them and oblivion. The Japanese Navy never imagined such a weapon. Their doctrine was built on armor, firepower, and honor. But war doesn't reward tradition, it rewards adaptation. The PT boats rewrote the equations of naval warfare. They proved that technology, innovation, and coordination could make a weapon far deadlier than size or rank. And behind those machines were boys who became veterans before they turned 25. They fought in darkness, in silence, knowing one shell could end them, yet they went out anyway. Some didn't come back. Those who did carried the sound of triple Packards in their hearts for the rest of their lives. In the end, the Pacific didn't belong to the biggest ships or the heaviest guns. It belonged to those who could think faster, move faster, and strike without warning. That night in October, when the destroyer WWII exploded in a bloom of fire, the world saw a glimpse of the future, a future where agility would defeat arrogance and innovation would triumph over intimidation. The Japanese destroyers weren't defeated by steel. They were defeated by speed, creativity, and the men who dared to defy the impossible. 80 feet of plywood, 40 knots of fury, and a lesson the world would never forget.